sun dying love surrounds me like a million suns. I've attempted to make this brief. My failure to do so, however, may surprise you. There's a lot I'd like to tell you, but I'm afraid that in 20 minutes I can't tell you everything. I'm just going to have to wait until I publish my book. Julia Stanley, a thin young woman whose red locks of hair floated in the breeze, sat alone on a bench on the pier overlooking the vast blue Irish Sea. A man in a Liverpool seaman's uniform approached the bench and asked, "Is this seat taken?" She looked at him and said, "Only if you take it." "Well, I'm taking it then," he said, sitting down next to her. "Why don't I also take a young lady to lunch with me?" "You might if I would," she said, "but I don't like your hat." He turned and laughed, showing her the arch of his pointed bird-like nose. He took his hat in his hand and threw it into the sea. Julia Stanley would later tell her friends, "That's when I fell in love with Alfred Lennon." Fred Lennon was a vagrant seaman, dodgy, unreliable, away at sea most of the time, and liable to fall into drink when home on leave. Julia was much the same in that her lack of regard for consequences, her insatiable need to seek fun and stimulation, and her sheer naivety led her more often than not into trouble. She was what one might call a free spirit. They married on a whim, Fred and Julia, just to spite her older sister, Mimi. Mimi was proper and austere, and their differences often led to conflicts and moments of poor judgment, just like this one. Soon, Julia was pregnant. From forth the fatal loins of this mother Julia, into a world of death and chaos was born a man who would change the face of the entire world. During the heavy German blitzkrieg of Liverpool, Julia gave birth to John Winston Lennon on the eve of October 9th, 1940. John's father walked out forever when he was 5 years old. His mother continued her life of sleeping around and shirking responsibility, often leaving John alone. Mimi took matters in her own hands and decided to raise John herself and barred Julia from John's life. John grew up without his parents. Angry at the world, he was rebellious, disrespectful to his elders, a bully to his peers. John was a terror as a child. John would shoplift, mouth off to teachers when he wasn't ditching class with his best friend Pete Shotton, smoke cigarettes and commit general delinquency as much as he could before curfew, when he would come home to Mimi, who did her best to beat that behavior out of him. When John was 16 years old, he met his mother. Pete Shotton had made the startling discovery that the mother, whom John could barely remember, lived and had lived only a stone's throw away from the very house he grew up in with Mimi. They made the walk and knocked on the door. John waited nervously on the front steps, waiting for an answer, shooting glances at Pete, who could only shrug. The sound of shuffling feet came from behind the door. The knob turned, and John was greeted by a portly, mustachioed man in his 30s. John and Pete were taken aback, and after an awkward silence, John blurted, "Is Julia about?" Before the man could respond, a splash of red burst out from behind him, screaming, "John!" Suddenly, for the first time in 11 years, John found himself encircled by the arms of his mother. Once they were together, they were inseparable. He became acquainted with the man, Bob Dykens, Julia's husband, and their children, Julia and Jacqueline. John spent as much time as he could with his mother. During evenings, during the day when skipping class, she baked for him, took him out to Blackpool for fun on the pier, and introduced him to rock and roll. Pop music in the mid-50s was just starting to blow up. Rock and roll music was brand new. Genres of music that had been invented by African Americans, like jazz, blues, and gospel, had started to come together to form a new kind of music with a steady backbeat and wild guitar riffs. Previously a black-only music, pioneers like Chuck Berry and Buddy Holly began playing to a whiter audience. In 1956, a ridiculously good-looking white boy from Tennessee released a single titled "Heartbreak Hotel," singing with a deep, sultry vibrato voice that electrified teenagers across America. His name was Elvis Presley, and he made rock and roll accessible to the world. He and other rock stars appeared in rock movies such as Love Me Tender that would fill the theaters with screaming teenagers. Girls swooned over the handsome Presley, and boys were impressed, perhaps intimidated, by his swagger. John wanted to be a rock star like Elvis Presley. This was an ambition condemned by Mimi and encouraged by Julia. Julia, the young and free spirit, sat across from John at home one afternoon, banjo in hand, and taught him how to play Miss Maggie May, a Liverpool folk song about a whore. 3 chords and 4 strings in, John was well on his way to becoming a rock star. Julia soon bought him his first guitar, a Galatone Champion. With it, he formed his first band, the Quarrymen, named after his high school, Quarrybank High. In 1957, with school friends, they played rock and roll in a country-like genre called skiffle, taught to John by his mother. One afternoon, John walked into Julia's home to find her in bed, taking a nap. He stood in the doorway and said nothing. She awoke, and with a voice thick with sleep, invited him to join her. He walked into the room and lay down on the bed across from her. She nuzzled comfortably with him, and she fell asleep. The sun came in through the window with a square of gold across Julia's red hair. John did not fall asleep, and instead gazed at the woman in his arms. He looked at the swell of her breasts and her sweater, and he regretted for the rest of his life the decision not to touch them. It is this moment wherein John was very much in love with his mother, who lay asleep and vulnerable and warm against his body. Upon leaving Mimi's home on the afternoon of July 15, 1958, Julia was struck by a speeding car and killed instantly. John's heart was shattered. He had not only lost his mother for the second time, but he also lost his first love to the hands of death. This death affected him for the rest of his life. He became motivated by a need for a mother and a need for love, the line between the two often becoming blurred. Julia, the final track of side 2 of the White Album, is a song about his mother. He calls her Ocean Child, the English translation of the name Yoko. John spent his life jumping from partner to partner, romantic, platonic, creative, or otherwise, in a cycle of codependence buffered by sex, drugs, and rock and roll. One of these partners on whom he imposed his need for love and guidance was Paul McCartney. When they met, a 15-year-old boy whose mother had also died recently. Finding kinship in their mutual loss, Paul and John became fast friends. Sitting across from each other in Paul's bedroom, they were like mirror images of each other, John playing with his right hand and Paul playing with his left. The mirror image would come to describe the greatest songwriting duo in music history. In 1960, they traveled to Hamburg on a work visa to play regularly at various clubs in Hamburg's famous red light district. Their stage presence was considerable. The Quarrymen, now renamed the Beatles, were known in Hamburg as the Crazy Beatles for their memorably wild performances. John was loud and brash and would mock audience members, make jokes, use funny voices, and dance and smash around the stage. Once, he even wore nothing but his underwear and a toilet seat. That night, he smashed a bottle over a sailor's head. 70s punk would seem tame compared to this. John's pain was manifesting itself in increasing violence and drink. He was lashing out at a world that had taken so much from him. All he could do was to take from the world what he could, his fists and his guitar, blinding himself from reality with drink, and barreling through life on amphetamines. It was during this time that John fell in love again, this time with an old maid from art school, Stuart Sutcliffe. Known to some as the 5th Beatle, Stu played the bass, though poorly, because he was a painter, not a musician. But he was John's best friend, and he wouldn't have Stu anywhere else but in his band. He became close in those days in Hamburg in their poor living conditions, sharing women and drugs. After long, Stu and the Beatles met Astrid Kircher, the photographer who gave them their iconic Beatle haircuts. She and Stu fell in love, and when he left the band, he moved in with her and her mother and planned to marry. During this period, he and John exchanged long, intimate letters, wherein John expressed to Stu his greatest fears and insecurities like he would to no other soul, except for maybe his lost mother. A letter from John to Stu, dated October 1961. I'm not going to do the dialect. I remember a time when everyone I loved hated me because I hated them. So what? So fucking what? I can't remember anything without a sadness so deep that it hardly becomes known to me. But his best friend would come to break his heart too. Stu Sutcliffe died of brain hemorrhaging in 1962. John was volatile and prone to extreme outbursts of violence, even to his closest loved ones. One day in Hamburg, without much warning, John let out on Stu and beat him to the ground and kicked him in the head. The Sutcliffe family cites this as the ultimate cause of Stu's death, and John suffered from guilt for the rest of his life and always feared that he killed his best friend. Heartbroken again, John turned himself completely over to Paul McCartney. Together, they began writing the songs that would skyrocket their careers. The Beatles were managed by Brian Epstein, a gay man from a wealthy Jewish family who nurtured and provided for the Beatles, providing John with what Paul could not, a mother. The Beatles touched down in America in February 1964. They performed in the Ed Sullivan Show on February 9, 1964, to a television audience of 73 million people, over a third of the entire U.S. population, and a record in television history. In that 30-minute set, they found fame that no mortal man had ever known. America in 1964 was incredibly conservative. Still a predominantly white Christian nation, many Americans rejected the feminine influence of the Beatles. Their long hair was a symbol of degeneracy and homosexuality. John didn't do much to help the Beatles' image with conservative America when he said, "Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. We're more popular than Jesus now." Jesus was all right, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. Referring primarily to the Church of England and its waning membership. The backlash was intense. Conservative religious groups in America decried Lennon's words and began a campaign of anti-Beatlemania. They protested at concerts, they burned Beatles records, there was even talk of Lennon being the Antichrist. The Ku Klux Klan was included in this frenzy, and they threatened quite seriously to kill the Beatles. The Beatles were suddenly in mortal danger simply by being in the United States. They had to travel with a police escort at all times. Security for the Beatles was now a life-or-death job. On top of this stress, Lennon felt guilty that he may have ruined his career and the careers of his bandmates by speaking without thinking. Meanwhile, Beatlemania remained strong among the young, the liberal, and the free-thinking. Every concert sold out, and every public appearance of the Beatles was met with the unremitting wall of sound, the hellish scream of thousands of fainting teenage girls. Despite their standing with conservative America, the Fab Four remained the most popular human beings on the planet. In 1965, the Beatles released Help as both a film starring themselves and an accompanying album. John recorded deeply personal songs like You've Got to Hide Your Love and the title track of the album, Help. While these songs saw less commercial success than did Paul's, they were groundbreaking in their honesty. John's persona was generally that of a tough guy, a loner, a joker, but in Help, in a format similar to Yesterday, John describes that since his youth, his life has fallen into confusion. In You've Got to Hide Your Love, John sings painfully about lost love and boarding it all up inside, perhaps speaking of his pent-up trauma from the death of his mother. The lyrics of these songs were painful and true, hidden behind the typically catchy tune of 60s rock. August 16, 1965, was the day of Brian Epstein's greatest triumph. He arranged a concert at Shea Stadium in New York. The stadium was filled with 55,600 screaming Beatlemaniacs. The Beatles were driven to a back entrance in an armored car, escorted by a contingent of 44 policemen. That's a number I made up. They ran across the stadium with their instruments to the stage, and they began their set. The scream was intense. More intense than any scream ever heard before on this planet and ever heard since. The Beatles stood in the center of the brightly lit stadium before thousands upon thousands of people who would give their very lives to hold hands with John Lennon. Into the middle of their second song of their set, they stopped playing. They stood there, looking at this frenzied crowd, and nobody noticed. The scream continued. John stood still with his guitar hanging from his shoulder and pondered the massive sound before him. They were in a bubble. Theirs had become a reality, utterly apart from our own. It was at this moment that John had to realize two things. One, that he sat on a throne which he could never abdicate, wearing a crown of thorns, ordained with infinite power. The second was that he could do so much more with it. In 1966, John discovered LSD, unrelated to the infinite power. The drug showed him the darkest parts of himself, and through his trips he faced them. He became aware of the violence and hate within him. In order to properly trip LSD, he learned one must shed the ego. which he endeavored then to do, though his failure to do so only makes him weak. The lyrics of Tomorrow Never Knows, the final track of Revolver, were taken directly from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Turn off your mind, relax, float downstream. That year, Brian Epstein was found dead in his home of a sleeping pill overdose. Another death, another heartbreak. John was spurred to push himself, to find himself. John and company traveled to India in 1967, taking along their wives to live with a Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, a man who led a commune wherein he taught the practice of transcendental meditation. For his entire life, John looked for the answer to life, the universe, and everything. He thought the Maharishi could tell him the answer. After spending months in the commune, often meditating for hours upon hours every day, John got bored and left. Disappointed, they never went back. In 1968, John divorced his wife, married Yoko Ono, and the following year he divorced the Beatles too. The 70s comprised the farthest reachings of John's search for truth and meaning in his life, and his solo career was its voice. His post-Beatles material differs from Beatles music in that the musicianship is less a factor, so much as the lyrics themselves. John took to preaching his philosophy through his music. He was an advocate for peace, which he and Yoko made many protests for. He was an atheist and a humanist. God is a concept by which we measure our pain, he says in the opening line to God, the final track to his first post-Beatle album, The Plastic Ono Band. God, I believe, is his crowning work of humanist thought. The meat of the song consists of a sweeping refrain, I don't believe in, followed by magic, Jesus, Zimmerman, I Ching, etc., culminating in, I just believe in me. The final lines are as follows. I was the dreamweaver, but now I'm reborn. I was the walrus, but now I'm John. And so, dear friends, you'll just have to carry on. The dream is over. If there is a God, he said, it's in all of us. All of these things he did not believe in had failed him. None had given him the answer he had been looking for. He knew that the answer was in himself, that the answer was within him. And if anybody wanted to find the answer, all they had to do was look within themselves, in their own lives. There ain't no guru who can see through your eyes, he said, and I found out. The third track on the Plastic Ono Band. This lesson is his greatest gift to the world. John still hated himself, though. He spent the early 70s on an alcoholic rampage known as the Lost Weekend. He was separated from Yoko and dating his assistant May Pang. John spent his time with a few musicians and Bill Spector, recording an album of oldies that never really got off the ground. He came home after long, not having learned much, save that debauchery no longer gave him what he needed. His Hamburg days were over. He was getting old. Not that all you 35-year-olds out there are old. Yoko gave birth to Sean Taro Ono Lennon on October 9th, 1945, on John's 35th birthday. John dedicated his life.
75.
I'm sorry?
75.
Oh, did I say 60? I have it written down 75. October 9th, 1975, on John's 35th birthday. John dedicated his life to raising his son and stopped recording music entirely. They lived a life of quiet, one might say wholesome, family raising for 5 years, using their money to keep them extremely comfortable and safe in their enormous New York apartment, the Dakota. Meantime, John receded from public life, living like a completely different person than the rock star John, who broke a bottle over a sailor's head in 1961, or dropped acid in 1967, or shot heroin in 1969. John was a father now, a good father. His entire life, he had searched for the answer, looked somewhere for happiness. His search catapulted him farther from his roots than he ever could have imagined, into drugs, transcendental meditation, primal scream therapy, unimaginable galaxies of fame. But where he found it was in his heart, in the heart of his son. He now lived unselfishly for his son, finding utmost meaning and happiness as Sean's caregiver, father, and friend. John recorded his final album, Double Fantasy, with his wife, his love, his creative partner, Yoko Ono, in 1980, after 5 years of silence. When I was making it, I was visualizing all the people in my age group, he said in what is commonly referred to as the last interview on the morning of December 8th, 1980. I'm saying, here I am now, how are you? How's your relationship going? Did you get through it all? Weren't the 70s a drag? Here we are, it's time to make the 80s good. But he wouldn't get a chance. On the evening of December 8th, 1980, Mark David Chapman, a mentally unstable security guard from Honolulu, shot John Lennon. He flew out to New York that morning from Honolulu, waited outside Dakota, and at 10:49 p.m. fired 5 hollow-point bullets from a .38 special revolver into Lennon's back. The police were summoned. Lennon was rushed to the hospital, while Chapman was arrested without incident. Lennon died at the hospital. His wounds were severe. For weeks after, fans stayed outside of Dakota to mourn en masse the death of their beloved. A memorial was constructed in Central Park, New York, with the word "Imagine" engraved in marble, the title of a song in which he envisioned a perfect world. There is a bronze sculpture of Lennon sitting on a bench in Havana, Cuba, forever looking out into the distance, looking for the answer. John's search for truth and meaning changed not only himself, but through raw honesty and disregard for boundaries, John Lennon left behind an epic legacy of music, change, and peace. His impact on human culture was wide and profound. Things we take for granted today, like rock music, the freedom to grow your hair, to talk about atheism, the necessity to talk of peace, we owe to John Lennon. Today, 53 years after they first played together, Beatles records still sell millions of copies every year. John's Happy Christmas War is Over is still played on radio and television every Christmas. When I cannot sing my heart, I can only speak my mind. Let us all sing our hearts. Let us all speak our minds. And let us push through our pain into new horizons of our own spirituality, our own truth. But we should probably do fewer drugs.